In the bustling hallway of a high school, the sound of laughter and lockers slamming echoed until a sharp, commanding voice sliced through the air. "Stop right there." The laughter ceased. Students turned their heads, curious yet cautious. A young girl, confident in her stride, froze as a police officer pointed at her from across the corridor. "You think you can just walk around here dressed like that? You think this is appropriate for school?" His voice carried an edge that made even the bystanders uneasy. The girl stood her ground, her voice steady but laced with disbelief. "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm not doing anything wrong." The officer stepped closer, towering over her. "Don't talk back to me. Young lady, you're setting a bad example, and I've had enough of this attitude." The crowd began to gather, whispers spreading quickly. "What's going on? Why is he targeting her?" She glanced around, her confidence beginning to waver. "I'm not setting any example," she said, her voice softer now but no less firm. "I'm just being me." The officer smirked, pulling out a pair of scissors from his belt. "Not anymore. Let's fix this attitude right here, right now." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone muttered, "He can't be serious." But he was. He grabbed her arm roughly and pushed her toward a chair that was conveniently placed outside the principal's office. "Sit down." "What are you doing?" she demanded, struggling to free herself. "You can't touch me like this." The officer didn't listen. He snapped his fingers at the school principal, who stood nearby, hesitant and silent. "Back me up here. You've been complaining about her disruption all week." The principal looked away, shame flickering in his eyes. But he didn't object. The girl's voice cracked, her panic and anger spilling out. "This is wrong. I haven't done anything to deserve this." The officer grabbed a fistful of her hair. The metallic snip of scissors filled the air as strands of her identity, her pride, fell to the floor. Her classmates stood frozen, horrified yet silent, their phones now pointed in her direction, capturing every cruel second. "Now everyone will see what happens when you don't follow the rules," the officer declared, his voice cold and triumphant. Tears burned her cheeks, not from pain, but from the humiliation coursing through her veins. She scanned the crowd, searching for a face, for anyone who might help. Instead, she found only shock, fear, and a few muffled sobs. One voice finally broke the silence. "This isn't right." It was faint, almost lost in the tension, but no one dared to step forward. The officer threw the scissors onto the table and stepped back, satisfied. "There. Maybe now you'll think twice before you disrespect authority." The girl sat motionless, her shaved head exposed, her dignity scattered like the hair at her feet. But just as the officer began to walk away, the heavy sound of rushed footsteps approached. The room's energy shifted instantly, the tension becoming almost suffocating. "What is going on here?" a voice thundered, low and commanding yet vibrating with fury. The officer turned, but his smirk faltered when he saw the man approaching. The crowd parted instinctively, making way for the figure who exuded power and authority. The girl's tear-filled eyes widened in recognition. Relief flooded her expression, though it was tinged with apprehension. The man stopped in his tracks, his eyes locking onto the officer and then drifting to the girl. His gaze darkened when he saw the scissors and the remnants of her hair on the floor. For a moment, there was silence, heavy, electric silence. Then, with a voice that could shake mountains, he spoke. "You," he said, pointing a finger at the officer, his tone icier than a winter storm. "Explain yourself. Right now." The officer stammered, trying to regain his footing. "She was being disruptive. I was enforcing discipline." "Discipline?" The man interrupted, stepping closer, his voice rising. "Discipline is one thing. Humiliation is another. You have no authority to do what you just did. None." The officer swallowed hard, but he wasn't ready to back down. She needed to be taught a lesson. "It's about respect." The man's voice cut through the room like a blade. "Respect? You think this is how you teach respect? By stripping a child of her dignity in front of her peers?" The girl's classmates began to murmur, the atmosphere thick with the weight of injustice finally being named. The officer tried to regain control. "I was doing my job." The man's fury was contained but barely. Your job, he said, leaning in, is to protect and serve, not to destroy and humiliate. And let me tell you, this isn't over. The girl looked up at the man, her fear giving way to a glimmer of hope. The officer, however, paled under the weight of the man's words. The crowd sensed that the balance of power had shifted. But how far? How much would this man go to ensure justice was served? The tension hung heavy in the air, begging the question, what happens next when someone like him refuses to let this injustice stand? The silence in the principal's office was electric, broken only by the sound of Marcus Carter's footsteps as he crossed the room. Each step was deliberate, heavy, a reminder that every second of inaction on the part of Principal Addison and Officer Grayson was being scrutinized. He stood still for a moment, his eyes scanning the scene. His daughter sitting in the chair, her head freshly shaven, strands of her hair scattered on the floor. Her hands trembled in her lap, though she quickly tried to hide it when she saw him. Marcus's jaw tightened, the muscles in his face barely containing the storm within him. He crouched in front of Naomi, his voice low but steady. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his eyes locking onto hers. Naomi blinked back tears, nodding, though her expression told a different story. "I'm fine," she whispered, her voice cracking. Marcus reached out, his hand hovering near her face but not touching her, as if afraid his anger might somehow transfer to her. "We'll deal with this," he said firmly. "I promise." He straightened, turning his attention to the others in the room. Principal Addison was pale, her hands clutching the desk as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Grayson, on the other hand, stood with his arms crossed, his smirk long gone but his arrogance still present in the way he held himself. "What's your explanation?" Marcus asked, his voice like a blade slicing through the tension. His question wasn't directed at anyone in particular, but his eyes lingered on Grayson. Grayson shifted his weight, trying to appear unaffected. "I was doing my job. Your daughter has been a disruption." "Disruption?" Marcus cut him off, his voice rising slightly. "Is that what you call this? Humiliating a child in front of her peers? Shaving her head without her consent? That's your idea of discipline?" Grayson's face flushed, but he didn't back down. She needed to learn respect. "Respect?" Marcus's laugh was bitter, sharp. "You're telling me that a trained officer, someone sworn to protect and serve, felt so threatened by a teenage girl's attitude that he resorted to this? Spare me." Addison cleared her throat, attempting to regain some semblance of control. "Mr. Carter, I think we need to discuss this calmly." "Calmly?" Marcus's gaze snapped to her, his voice icy. "You sat here and let this happen. You're as complicit as he is." Addison flinched but didn't argue. Instead, she fumbled with a pen on her desk, avoiding eye contact. I didn't know it would escalate like this." "Escalate?" Marcus repeated, his anger building. "You didn't know, or you didn't care enough to stop it. Which is it?" Grayson stepped forward, his tone defensive. "Look, I followed protocol. If you have an issue with that, take it up with the school board." "Oh, I will," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "But before I do, you're going to explain to me, right here, right now, what gave you the right to touch my daughter?" Grayson hesitated, the weight of Marcus's words settling over him. "I don't have to explain myself to you." "You don't?" Marcus stepped closer, his towering presence forcing Grayson to take a step back. "Because from where I'm standing, you have a lot to explain, and you'd better start now." The tension was suffocating, the air thick with the unspoken consequences of every word exchanged. Naomi watched silently, her eyes darting between her father and Grayson. She'd never seen Marcus like this, so controlled yet so undeniably furious. It was both terrifying and comforting. Grayson's bravado faltered, but he wasn't ready to back down entirely. "Your daughter has been causing issues for months. I was addressing a pattern of behavior." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "A pattern? Tell me, Officer Grayson, what exactly is this pattern? And while you're at it, explain how shaving her head addresses it." Grayson opened his mouth to respond but closed it again. his silence speaking volumes. That's what I thought, Marcus said, his voice cutting through the room like steel. This wasn't about discipline. This was about power. You wanted to humiliate her because you could, because you thought no one would hold you accountable. Addison finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Carter, we can resolve this. Perhaps if we file a formal complaint. No, Marcus interrupted, his tone resolute. A formal complaint isn't enough. My daughter deserves more than a piece of paper in a file. She deserves justice. He turned to Naomi, his expression softening for a moment. Do you want to go home? Naomi shook her head. No, I want to stay. Marcus nodded, his pride in her quiet resilience shining through. He faced Grayson and Addison again, his tone resolute. Here's what's going to happen. First, you're going to apologize to my daughter, right here, in front of everyone. Then you're going to step down from your position, Officer Grayson. And if you think for 1 second that I'm bluffing, you're welcome to test me. Grayson's jaw tightened. You can't force me to do anything. Marcus smirked, though there was no humor in it. I'm a civil rights attorney. You think I can't? By the time I'm done, you won't just lose your job, you'll lose your badge, your reputation, and any shred of credibility you have left. So go ahead. Refuse. I dare you. The room fell into an uneasy silence, the weight of Marcus's words pressing down on everyone. Grayson looked to Addison for support, but she was already shaking her head. I think you should listen to him, Addison said quietly. This has gone too far. Grayson stared at her, his anger boiling just beneath the surface, but he knew he was cornered. With a reluctant sigh, he turned to Naomi, his voice clipped and insincere. I'm sorry. Naomi's eyes narrowed, her voice steady but firm. You're not sorry. You're just scared. Grayson didn't respond, his expression darkening. Marcus stepped between them, his voice final. Get out. Grayson hesitated, but eventually turned and walked out of the office, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the room, leaving behind a silence that felt almost deafening. Marcus exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing for the first time since he'd entered. He looked at Addison. This isn't over. I'll be in touch. Addison nodded, her face pale. I understand. Marcus turned to Naomi, extending a hand. Let's go. Naomi hesitated for a moment before taking his hand. As they walked out of the office, the eyes of students and teachers followed them, their silence a mix of shock, awe, and respect. The hallway seemed quieter than before, the tension from earlier replaced by an unspoken understanding. Marcus didn't say anything as they walked to the car, his grip on Naomi's hand firm but gentle. It wasn't until they were seated inside that he finally spoke. You're stronger than you know, he said softly, and I'm so proud of you. Naomi looked at him, her eyes swelling with tears. I don't feel strong. Marcus smiled, his expression warm and reassuring. You are. And this, what happened today, it doesn't define you. It defines him. Naomi nodded, her resolve slowly returning. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in hours, she felt like she could face it. And Marcus, true to his word, was already planning his next move. This wasn't just about Naomi anymore. It was about ensuring that no one else would ever have to endure what she had. And he wouldn't stop until justice was served. The ride home was heavy with unspoken emotions. Naomi stared out the window, watching the familiar streets of Brighton Heights blur into a kaleidoscope of colors as her father drove in tense silence. The air between them was thick, not with anger, but with something deeper. Unanswered questions, unresolved feelings, and the raw, simmering pain of what had just happened. Marcus finally broke the silence, his voice measured but heavy with emotion. Naomi, he began, glancing at her through the rearview mirror. I need you to tell me everything. Don't leave anything out. Naomi hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. You already saw what happened, she said softly, her voice tinged with exhaustion. Marcus shook his head. I saw the aftermath. I need to understand what led up to it. I need to know how far this man has gone before today. Naomi drew in a shaky breath, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. It's not just today, Dad. It's been happening for months. Grayson, he's always had it out for me. He stops me in the hall for no reason. Asks me where I'm going like I'm sneaking around. Last month, he said my hair was distracting. She swallowed hard, her voice breaking. I ignored it because I thought it would blow over. I thought if I kept my head down, he'd get bored and leave me alone. Marcus's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles turning white. Why didn't you tell me? I didn't want to bother you, Naomi admitted, her eyes dropping to her lap. You're always so busy with work, fighting for other people. I thought I could handle it. Marcus pulled over abruptly, turning to face her fully. Naomi, listen to me, he said, his voice low but intense. You are never a bother to me. Never. Do you understand that? Naomi nodded, tears streaming down her face. I just didn't think it would go this far, she whispered. I didn't think he'd do this. Marcus reached over, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. You should never have had to think about how far someone like him would go. That's not on you. It's on him. They sat there for a moment, the car engine idling as the weight of their words hung in the air. Finally, Marcus spoke again, his tone firm. This is bigger than Grayson now. What he did to you wasn't just wrong. It was criminal, and I'm going to make sure he pays for it. Naomi's eyes met his, a spark of hope flickering amidst the pain. How? Marcus smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. That's what I do. Remember? I fight for people who've been wronged. And this time, I'm fighting for you. The next morning, Marcus was already on the phone before the sun rose. His contacts list was long, and his reputation as one of the most tenacious civil rights attorneys in the state preceded him. By the time Naomi woke up, groggy and still emotionally drained, her father had already secured meetings with several key players. Naomi, he said as she entered the kitchen, we're going to the station first. I filed a formal complaint against Grayson, and they're expecting us. Naomi hesitated, her stomach nodding. Do I have to go? I don't want to see him again. Marcus placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You won't have to speak to him, but your statement is critical. They need to hear it from you. She nodded reluctantly, the thought of facing the institution that had employed someone like Grayson filling her with dread. Still, she trusted her father. If anyone could ensure she was heard, it was him. At the police station, the atmosphere was tense. Officers moved with purpose, some casting curious glances as Marcus and Naomi entered. They were directed to a small conference room where an internal affairs officer greeted them. Mr. Carter, the officer began, extending a hand. I've reviewed the preliminary report. Let me assure you, this matter is being taken seriously. Good, Marcus replied, his tone clipped. Because what happened to my daughter is not just a violation of protocol, it's a violation of her rights. Naomi sat quietly as her father and the officer discussed the logistics of the investigation. When it was her turn to speak,